Welcome to Communicology. I'm Richard Talbert. I'm an associate professor of media and communication, and I love studying how people communicate. I'm also interested in how communication and culture intersect. Today I want to wrestle a little bit with a more challenging topic, and that's the idea of hate speech. Now, we've talked before in previous episodes about the First Amendment and about freedom of speech, and even about protest and things like that. But at what point does it get to cross that line to where we say that's too far? Because if you remember, in the First Amendment, it starts off, Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech, which means there's no law. You're allowed to say whatever you want. But if you also recall, we talked about how whenever you see one right restricted, it's because it's clashing with another right. So again, if somebody were to come into your house and spout off and say everything you want, you can kick them out because you have the right to your privacy, to your private property, and on your private property, you can, do whatever you wish to that extent, and your rights trump their free speech rights. But what if I'm out in public? What if I'm someplace in literal legal public space, government-owned space? Can government, censor me? Well, yeah, sure. Again, if you have a situation where your speech and someone else's rights have to wrestle, and then courts have to decide which one takes precedence. And sometimes, especially when it comes to speech, actually most of the time when it comes to speech, the government sides with the speaker, because in our country, it's that important to understand how important the freedom of speech is, because it wasn't that long ago in foreign lands before the founding fathers came over that you would be tried, convicted, and either sentenced to prison or some other kind of deforming punishment, or even executed for saying the wrong words about the wrong person at the wrong time. And then whenever the founding fathers came here, when it was still just the colonies before it became officially the United States, again, those same traditions and laws came over here. And the founding fathers said, I think it's important that people should be able to say what they want to say. And the result is, well, there are nearly no limits on speech because it's that important. Now, what if someone says something terrible and mean and awful? Well, that's the basis of today's episode, because there gets to be a point of time where, okay, you've crossed the line, pal. You said too much, or you said something too awful, and something should happen. Because we have talked before about the idea of the responsibility of the speaker. It's the whole Spider-Man thing, with great power comes great responsibility. Well, it's important because if I can say pretty much anything without any kind of restriction, that's a lot of power. I mean, can you imagine just that kind of power? And most people thankfully don't understand it and don't run amok with it, but you could do a lot of crazy stuff with that power and convince a lot of people to follow you. You can do all kinds of things with just the freedom of speech. But you can also do a lot of damage and harm and really hurt people. And, from an ethical standpoint, it's easy to draw that line and say, well, okay, yeah, ethically you shouldn't do that. But legally, this is what we're going to talk about today, because that's where the rub is, and the rub always is when you're discussing the concept of hate speech. Because as courts have noticed and wrestled with for a long time, what's hate? And who gets to define hate? And who gets to define whether or not they've been injured? Now, the landmark case that goes back for this is one that's known as Chaplinsky v. New Hampshire from 1942. And one of the key lines from that case is that, fighting words are words that by their very utterance inflict injury or tend to incite such an immediate breach of peace. It has been well observed that such utterances are no essential part of any exposition of ideas, and are of such slight social value as a step to truth that any benefit that may be derived from them is clearly outweighed by the social interest in order and morality. You can see that statement is full of booby traps. And quite frankly, it's amazing that it even happened, but it's one of those things that, the Supreme Court, as I tell my students, is just made up of 9 people, and people make mistakes, people make bad rulings all the time. But you can see all the dangers in this, which is why Chaplinsky has had several restraints on it over the years, in the narrowing of Chaplinsky, thankfully, frankly. And I'll talk about more of those as we move along. But let's look at some of these comments. So the concept of fighting words, as I mentioned in the beginning of this statement, is the idea that I say something so egregious, you just start swinging, and that's one of the things that can happen. I say a bad thing to you and you just want to punch me in the nose, So what responsibility is there on the speaker? But one thing we also have to remember is what responsibility is there on the hearer? Because, I'm sure you've come across someone who's offended by the slightest thing. So if somebody has very thick skin, then maybe they can take insults, no big deal. Growing up Gen X, when everybody had your mom jokes and things like that, it was very common to get insulted, and we just rolled with it because that's the way it was. Someone younger who hasn't had to go through that kind of thing growing up might be really upset and by the slightest word. Who gets to decide how upset? So someone with very thin skin starts swinging and becomes a problem. They even kind of mimic, mock this a little bit, like in the Back to the Future trilogy, that every time somebody would call Marty McFly chicken, that was it. You can call him anything, but don't you dare call him chicken. Is calling someone a chicken really that big of a deal? Well, to him it was. To someone else, you're just asking him if he wants to get dinner. So how do you define what a fighting word is? And that's what was at the crux of Chaplinsky. So it says here, by their very utterance, they'll inflict injury. This is one of those things that today you hear the saying, like, words are violence. When you think of actual violence, what is it? What do you mean that words, the actual utterance of them inflict injury? I mean, hurt your feelings? Is that injury? Make you second guess yourself? Is that injury? You can see how hard this would be to really quantify and understand. And you can see also it's radically different for people. So again, calling someone chicken, no big deal. Another person chicken, and it's a major insult. And that's just, of course, one of the more milder words that we could even think of. But I'm not going to use those in the example, of course, because, well, everyone should be able to view this and not have to worry too deeply about how much they have to censor it. But then again, there are certain words that are no need to be censored for a lot of people. You can drop certain words and one person thinks it's, offensive, another person thinks it's no big deal. That's one of the biggest problems with this. So it can, by utterance, inflict injury or tend to incite an immediate breach of the peace. So again, here's where you see the rub. So the need to keep peace and the need to, have freedom of speech. Well, in Chaplinsky, they're saying there are certain words that go so far that the need for peace outweighs the freedom of speech. That's where you see this. But again, whose peace? Where? In what sphere? And again, I'm not talking ethics. I'm not talking morality, because, you look in Scripture. Scripture is very clear about being vulgar, about offensive words, about harming your brother with your speech. There's tons of examples in Scripture about doing that. And including the 9th commandment about bearing false witness. You if you are saying words that can damage the reputation of your brother, that's terrible. But again, that's a moral standard from Scripture. We're talking legal. So again, you can see how this becomes really, really challenging, because who gets to determine that kind of level of when it's a breach of peace? And so you see this situation where it says that, like, the language that is used in fighting words is so bad that it provides no moral benefit for society. Again, who makes that decision? I mean, has anyone ever had a hard word for you where you needed to hear something that just put you in your place? I mean, there are times that we love hearing compliments, but there are times that we need to be told something very harsh and need to be put in our place. It doesn't have to be like a crippling, vulgar insult, but just something very hard, and puts us in our place. That might be necessary. And sometimes if someone's doing something so egregious, the blurting of a word might get them to stop and rethink what they're doing. Again, have I crossed that line? Well, Chaplinsky would say yes. But if you move in further to Terminello versus Chicago, this is 1949, the Supreme Court narrowed that scope of what's fighting words. And this is where you brought the term, something that brings up a clear and present danger. And again, what we see coming to play here is a concept of direct immediacy. So saying something that could be perceived as a threat, but the person's never truly going to act on it, is different than someone who's literally about to act on that threat. So if I say, "Oh, I'm going to kill you for doing that," is that really? Am I really going to kill that person? Or is it one of those things where I'm just like kind of like saying it to vent, And we see that kind of stuff on social media all the time. We see all kinds of references of threats to political people that you don't like, so that they just say awful, vile, harmful things, and like, oh my goodness, this person should be investigated. Well, are they blowing off steam, or are they doing credible, actionable, and immediate, kind of calls to action? That's a big deal. And Feiner versus People of the State of New York, 1951, Supreme Court held that fighting words doctrine, and incitement of a riot creates a clear and present danger. It's not protected. So this one's also very much a relevant thing when you look at like all the protesting and things that happens in different places and times across the country. Are you just? It's one thing to incite a protest, which is legal. Remember, you're allowed to peaceably assemble. But if you're telling people to storm the barricades, to fight with the police, to turn over the cop cars and set them on fire, to throw bricks through the storefront, to loot the storefront, and you're trying to urge them on, that's, again, we're talking about that immediacy kicking in, like you're trying to get people to do something not just bad, but do it bad and do it now. So the idea that you're seeing this come into play where I'm trying to incite a riot, I'm trying to get it to happen, that's where you see a lot of things. This kind of also comes to mind, the idea when you hear people talking about, yelling fire in a crowded theater. Like, it's illegal to yell fire in a theater. No, actually, it's illegal to incite a riot. But if you yelled fire and nobody moves, you didn't break a law. But if you yell a fire and try to get people all worked up and get them to run for their lives, and people get crushed and people get hurt or killed, you incited that. So now you have to pay the price for doing that. But if you just yell fire and everyone sits there, no harm, no foul. Also, Texas v. Johnson, this is more recent, 1989, Supreme Court redefines the scope of fighting words to mean words that are, quote, a direct personal insult or an invitation to exchange fisticuffs, unquote. And this was all about flag burning of the U.S. flag. And like, some people love the flag and cherish it so much that if you set it on fire, then I can attack you. Well, that's symbolic speech. It's a political speech act, so you can do it. And it's heart, it's a piece of fabric, but what does that fabric stand for? So to some people who don't like America, they think it's just this filthy, awful symbol. But for people who love America, it's a very deeply important thing to them, that it carries and just imbued with all kinds of important meaning. Well, someone sets it on fire, you're going to want to react to that. Well, the question with Texas v. Johnson comes to the idea of, well, is there a direct personal insult? Well, burning a flag isn't personal, in that I am burning your own personal flag. This one's yours. I took it off your porch and now I'm going to burn it. That would be a little bit different, but just burning a flag in public doesn't rise to that level. It's the same kind of concept. I've had issues in court cases before where someone wore like a t-shirt or jacket with swear words on it. And like, while it might be offensive to moral ethics, for morality and ethics, but it's not going to be like directed directly at you. So it wouldn't be a fighting words issue because It wasn't directed to you. It was just basically to everybody. They're just broadcasting what they say about words. So that's a big thing. But the idea that it's a direct personal insult or an invitation to exchange fisticuffs. Again, we're talking about inciting things. So I'm saying something to a point to get you so like I am trying to get you to fight. So it's not like I just insult you and just figure you're going to take it. I'm really trying to get you. I'm egging you on. So when you see two people like on some viral video who are yelling at each other and they're saying the worst stuff they can to each other, they're trying to get the other person to rise to the occasion to swing first. Thinking that whoever swings first is the aggressor. But as we see in some of these fighting words cases, the person who tries their hardest to get the other person to swing might very well be deemed the aggressor. And then you see RAV versus the city of St. Paul. This is from 1992, where the Supreme Court finds that the First Amendment prevents government from punishing speech and expressive conduct because it disapproves of the ideas expressed. This is a situation where there's a concept of what's known as viewpoint discrimination. So in this case, there was some cross burning that from one group doing it was fine, another group doing it not so much. So it's like, well, wait a minute, if burning a cross is bad, it's always bad across all time and space and reasons. And, viewpoint discrimination is one of those things that you see and hear and wrestle with a lot, especially like on college campuses, because, when you have situations where the bulk of faculty, which is common in most college campuses, the bulk of the faculty are on the political left, and you have a minority that are on the political right, and you see speech codes that are geared specifically towards the people on the right, well, now you're doing viewpoint discrimination. So now you can see this is a situation where you have a problem, and you kind of wrestle with, well, who gets the say. So it's okay to egg on this one political group to fight, but you can't egg on this one because that's mean. Well, no. If it's vile to do it one way, it's vile to do it the other. Or if it's okay to do one way, it's okay to do the other. So you see that kind of thing coming to play with wrestling. So let's get back to where the problem comes again with hate speech from the very beginning. Just like with beauty is in the eye of the beholder. You might look at one person and say, I like a brunette, I like a redhead, I like a blonde, whatever. It's the same thing with language and speech. I've got fairly thick skin. I don't like being insulted, but it's one of those things that comes with the territory. And when you read enough teacher evaluations, you realize you're going to get insulted. And then, plus, I was a former politician. That's very common to get insulted when you're a politician. It just comes with the territory, and you just learn to live with it because of it. Everything that bothered you thought about it would be crippling. Again, from my moral standpoint, from a Christian standpoint, I wish people wouldn't do it. And it's hard to, it's hard to deal with that because you wish society was better than it is. But the truth of the matter is there are people who are going to say things that are uncomfortable, things that are mean, and things that are sometimes downright vile. Should they be allowed to say it? Well, from a legal standpoint and on public ground, yes, legally they should be allowed. Morally, should they? No. I mean, clearly you're violating so many aspects of Scripture when you say vile and hateful things. Now, where it gets really difficult is when you start splitting the hair of what's vile and mean. So, for example, I had a student who got upset because this student was transgender. Another student gave a speech on why transgender athletes shouldn't be allowed in female sports. And this student was upset because that student was allowed to give the speech. Like, it's a speech class. We wrestle with ideas, and sometimes people try to persuade other people. Well, they were upset that other speech was going on. Once silence, we're talking about silencing opposing views. That's when things get really dangerous. That's going back to the echo chamber discussion from before, that you get so deep in your echo chamber that anything that even bumps against that echo chamber, you want it silenced. That's when things get really dangerous, and that's the problem with speech codes in general. Whenever you see speech codes on college campuses or other places that are public, it's one of those situations where you're like, okay, is this a blanket thing or is this a viewpoint discrimination thing? And we start seeing those kind of problems pop up. So the real issue, that we have to deal with is, one, we should seek to be ethical communicators. We should have a stronger moral code where we care more about other people. Again, love your neighbors, also love your enemies. So that's important. Bearing false witness, making accusations that aren't proven, or just firing from the hip when we don't know all the facts. That's also very bad, very dangerous. And, we can cause a lot of damage, just with people with our tongues. So we should be more careful how we say things. But of course, that doesn't stop us from speaking things truthfully, but in love. And it's also one of those things that we have to realize that sometimes people are more triggered than other people. Does that mean we should stop talking? No, but we should also know where our legal rights are, in addition to our moral foundation, where we start in the beginning. So again, as we look forward to dealing with the idea of what's a hate speech and what's fighting words, again, the best recourse is to not get that far in the first place, right? But it's also important to understand that sometimes it's in the ear of the beholder for those situations, and we need to figure out how to work through from there. And the Supreme Court has often, sided with speech. Lower courts, they sometimes keep going back to Chaplinsky. It's just one of those things that you have to work with and try to go. And so my advice is not to get that far in the first place so you don't have that issue. So thanks for tuning in today. I hope that you liked the episode. Please like, share, and subscribe to my YouTube channel. And if you didn't like what you heard, thank you very much for tuning in anyway. But we'll see you next time on Communicology.